Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the terrific work being done by scholars who have used the historical research materials held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Gerard Fitzgerald is a lecturer at the University of Virginia and a visiting scholar at the Greenhouse Center at the Stavanger University in Stavanger, Norway. Gerard, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
You're
Glad
welcome.
to be there here today.
Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak.
Okay.
What is it you're researching and writing about at the moment?
My new book is called Harvest for War. It's an environmental history of industrialization in the U.S. during World War One. I was trained. My PhD is formerly from Carnegie Mellon in history of technology, and I was trained. I dealt with chemical weapons and basically industrial research. I've sort of wandered about 10 years ago. I wandered over to environmental history. I followed Ed Russell over there, and I define myself now as a military environmental historian, which is a pretty active subfield. So one of the things I just about to finish a book on biological warfare and airborne disease, and one of the things that was interesting in graduate school was we didn't spend a lot of time talking about World War One. And the first paper I published actually is a paper for the American Journal of Public Health on the public health history of chemical weapons during World War One. So I sort of became a chemical weapons expert and a World War I expert, even though I was an expert on neither topic actually, but that sort of like got me interested. So I started writing a second book. The centennial of the war was coming up, but I got because I was someone asked if I wanted to write about chemical weapons for a book that John McNeill and Richard Tucker did called Environmental Histories of the First World War. So I wrote a chapter on history of Edgewood Arsenal, which is actually a close to where we are right now. And I thought maybe I could write a whole book about World War One and how the U.S. sort of approached it from an environmental aspect. That's why I came up to Hagley because I'm interested in something that happened in 1917, 18, which we'll talk about at length, I suppose, today, and also the Pennsylvania Railroad. And then you guys have a gigantic collection on the Pennsy, and I wanted to get some more granular detail about what happened in 1917, actually. So
That sounds like a really rich topic.
it is. I think it's interesting. I was out at the Linda Hall Library in 2018 for the centennial, and a lot of us were hoping that people would get more interested in World War One, and actually, that moment sort of passed. It's still kind of a limited topic. I think I think World War Two sort of basically historiographically outshines the First World War. But I'm finding a lot of stuff that actually was really successful in the First World War, and I think now I used to do this when I used to teach. I'd compare the two wars, and I think what's interesting. I think if World War One ends earlier than it's supposed to. Most American contracts for munitions, everything else, were for the spring of 1919 for the big offensive never took place. I think if like World War II had ended in like the spring or the summer of 1943, I think we'd have a very different approach to like how we view American industrial with no B-29s, little use of radar, no atomic bombs. So World War One actually sort of ends earlier than the U.S. We're planning on making a big splash in 1919, 1920. So I'm looking at um, how various industrial sectors of the U.S. are looking at the environment and how they were basically plotting to basically build a war machine and also basically plotting for the post-war.
Hmm.
Um, and the one thing I'm writing about Hagley is in 1917, 1918, New York Harbor shuts down for 2 months. There's this tremendous storm that comes down from Canada. It goes as far west as Nashville, and then it basically sort of moves east and it sits there. And a couple things are happening in 1917. Basically, at that point, that was the largest point of embarkation for the war. Basically, about 9,000 to 10,000 vessels a year are coming to New York Harbor. There were 12 major railroads that get to New Jersey, but they can't get to New York because New York was actually unique almost in the whole world. And there's still no the railroad tunnel they want to build under New York Harbor now. McAdoo wanted to build that back in like 1912. They still haven't built a freight tunnel into New York. And that was a major problem back then. So all the railroads were shipping freight east. And when the war begins, I should say our economy kind of like goes like a rubber band up and down, basically. Usually when there's a war economy, things expand. Well, all markets in Europe kind of collapse, basically. So the American economy goes up and down. And then as we start shipping more and more stuff east, for some reason, stuff just keeps all the rolling stock, all the freight cars, all the box cars, wind up staying on the East Coast. In January of 1917, there were 145,000 extra freight cars on the East Coast. And when this storm hits, they literally get frozen in place. And a couple of things happened here. First of all, they can't move anything, so they can't basically unload anything. There's actually a bit of a coal shortage. So all the ships through New York Harbor are going to be basically loaded with coal from the railroad cars. And they basically use barges and lighters. So those things can't go out into the ice. So basically, all maritime and railroad transportation completely shuts down. This is actually what actually expedites President Wilson's nationalization of the railroads, beginning of the United States Railroad Administration. I should also say I'm a model railroader and railroads are my hobby. And I'd read, and I read a lot of railroad history, and I'd occasionally see people talking about this big storm in 1917, but no one ever like really wrote about it. Everyone would say everything kind of, and I couldn't figure it out. And I just, when I was at Linda Hall, I basically went through all of Railroad Age and found some articles. And if I needed more information, I knew you guys had the stuff on the Pensy. So what I'm doing up at Hagley is trying to figure out exactly how the Pensy dealt with this. Actually, the Pensy was, the New York Central people will argue the Pensy is the most important railroad in the United States. It's the biggest, it's the largest, it's the most powerful. Your collection is so large. Remember when the archivist showed me the finding aid, I thought she meant those are all the finding aids for like everything, and it's like, no, it's just a Pensy collection. I was like, oh my god, that's a lot of stuff. So the stuff I saw the last time I was there for my like pre-visit showed me that there was a lot of information about what the Pennsylvania was doing. And the failure of the U.S. railroad here is important for a lot of reasons. The railroads are basically very self-conscious of their inability to meet the war effort, actually. But the thing that intrigues me as an environmental historian is their inability to deal with weather, actually. And actually, when the war begins, the president of the B&O and the president of Pensy go up to the Hill and go up to Congress, and they talk about how the railroads are going to deal with the war. And they both basically say they're unprepared for the war. They say infrastructure is not in good shape. They've spent all their money. The Panama Canal is actually opened in 1914, which actually New York's happy about, but it actually brings more traffic to New York. At this point, New York is actually going through some infrastructure changes. I'm from New Jersey, like all the port stuff that's in Port Newark now, that actually comes out of what happens in World War I. They have to basically build more port facilities outside of Brooklyn and Staten Island, which is why they build New Jersey, where Newark Airport is. So what happens in World War I is actually really important, has a lot of ripples going forward in time. But one of the things I'm interested in is basically looking at how large industrial firms like the Pennsylvania talk about things like the weather and environment. Because this is like, they have to deal with this every day. Basically, what do you do if the entire railroad shuts down? That's a national embarrassment. The president's mad at you. They've nationalized something. I mean, basically, what's also going on here, and I'm still familiarized with this literature, is was it Douglas Craig wrote a book called Progressives at War. Wilson's cabinet's being very famous for being progressive, and I'm really intrigued as an environmental historian. What does progressivism mean at this time period for the environment, actually? There's another book that I found. I got this at a used bookstore in Charlottesville. It's called Conservation of the U.S. of Natural Resources in the U.S. by Charles Van Hise. Van Hise was a geologist, former president of the University of Wisconsin. I got this book for 50 cents, actually. But the book sort of encapsulates what I'm writing about. He wants to know, like, what are the natural resources of the United States in 1910? What does that mean for right now? What does that mean for the future? So I've been looking at a lot of industrial journals, like the Journal of Industrial Chemistry, and trying to see, are people talking about natural resource allocation? Are they talking about limits on things? And how are they basically then approaching that? And World War I is really interesting, and wars are always interesting from both a technological and R&D standpoint, and also from a natural resource allocation standpoint, is people throw a lot of resources at a problem really quickly, and they're not really worried about the short-term problems. So there's actually a lot of paper in Washington about World War I that hasn't really been read by a lot of scholars. And a lot of the other book that tangentially deals with the Hagley chapter deals with the War Industries Board. You have basically William McAdoo, who is actually the initial basically Director General of the USRA, is actually Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, who has his own presidential aspirations for after the war, which don't go anywhere. Newton Baker is Wilson's basically Secretary of War. Bernard Baruch, famous name, basically head of the War Industries Board. All these people are interacting with each other during this period. I'm actually intrigued to see what they're saying about industry, about the American economy, what they're seeing about America's potentiality. Obviously, lately, and I mean, last 2 weeks, hearing a lot about President McKinley and President Roosevelt and basically American imperialism. This is a really interesting period for me in American history. You have progressives and you have American imperialism, sort of fighting it out. Action World War One. I haven't decided this yet with the book, but I'm sort of arguing in a way. I'm about to send it a chapter on the Philippines and chemical weapons. About this is an imperial war in some ways for America too, and I think we tend to see World War One as an imperial war for our European allies, but not for the United States actually. So that's sort of what's going on. But I like the Hagley archives. I mean, my partner was a former Hagley fellow at Delaware. She worked with Arwen, and yeah, you guys just have an amazing archive. And the Pennsylvania Railroad is an amazing resource because it was the most important railroad, I think, in American history. And I'm someone who models at Chesapeake and Ohio, so I have some Pennsy bias, by the way. But being able to look at the reports day to day and see how the Pennsy was dealing with things is really interesting to me. And how are they going to get out of this mess? Actually, I mean, they have to just wait for it to get warm. That's not really going to work when the president's sending people down every day to find out why is New York Harbor closed. Actually, I'm actually sort of surprised this has sort of remained not a secret, but hasn't really been in the American mainstream until now. I published one article in 2020 for who did I publish it with? I published it with Arcadia, which is the Rachel Carson Center's online journal. I wrote a mini article about this, but the chapter is going to be much longer. But the Hagley archival sources are important because I can get into the actual granular detail of how the Pennsy was dealing with stuff. Mm-hmm. One thing that seems about the Pennsy got a different record keeping system than most other railroads. Like I'm really familiar with this Chesapeake and Ohio, Norfolk and Western. And the Pennsy basically had both like a vertical and horizontal system to their organizational files, which I find both exciting and annoying in a way. But like they have a lot more data there, but it's a lot of stuff to find. But when you find this stuff, and the stuff that I plan to get when I come back is really amazing actually, and it's interesting. They're just going carload by carload actually. And I think, and I know basically historians are supposed to ask big questions, but here, like I think the microscopic data, the macro data about what's going on at particular actual harbor locations in New Jersey tells us a lot about what's going on all the way back to like South Dakota and California. This is affecting every railroad all the way basically going east from Los Angeles and San Francisco through Chicago. So it's a really interesting story.
Well, now you've really piqued my curiosity.
Okay.
How does the big storm of 1917 appear in the PRR archives?
They start to, I mean, basically people know in October there might be a problem actually. It gets really cold. And like I said, the Pennsy, the B&O president had been to the Hill recently, talked to Congress and was sort of asking for money, but we're not giving you any money. Like it didn't really work like that back then. But they were sort of worried, but they weren't expecting a storm of this magnitude actually. And basically the weather keeping meteorology was a younger science back then. They didn't have like long-term forecasting, but this storm is really, really bad and it just sort of stays. And by Thanksgiving, things are really, really in bad shape and things are starting to shut down. And basically coal movements are starting to shut down. They're worried about shipping coal and food to Massachusetts at this point. There's actually questions about basically like a shortage, like not talking about starvation, they're talking about serious food shortages in New England because basically nothing can get through New Jersey to New York to basically go up to New England that way. And things aren't really going to Chicago except to New York. So this is actually like a serious both home front problem and a national security problem for the war actually. And by the time they realize that this storm is going to be not going away, that they can't do anything about it. So they basically really just have to sweat it out until March, actually, until February things melt, and they just try to make the best of a bad situation. I've been hard pressed to figure out how this affects the war. I think enough stuff was already sitting in Lyon and the places in France. It wasn't a problem. But if you read newspapers like the New York Times and the Boston Herald, this is a day-to-day problem. People are really worried about it, actually. This storm basically goes from Nashville, basically touches slightly to Atlanta, goes to like Norfolk and goes all the way up to Boston. But people wrote about weather differently back then. And I've actually found some older papers. I've actually found a couple of papers in some journals about this storm itself, not about the railroad. So I have the railroad history and I have the weather history. I'm trying to basically get them together. Now I'm trying to basically look at the actual, how the railroads dealt with it on a day-to-day basis. Literally people were using pickaxes and flares and setting fires on the rails to move things, but there was so much rolling stock they couldn't actually move things out. Actually, like the entire system came to a complete halt. Actually, this also didn't make the Americans look good with respect to our allies. Actually, So it was basically, I think it was embarrassing for President Wilson. It was a big step up for his son-in-law McAdoo. This was his chance to shine, and he basically did. McAdoo actually earlier had been in charge of the tunnel project. The Pennsy actually tried building a tunnel under the Hudson River before. That was actually McAdoo's first railroad project, which doesn't actually work. I have his memoirs. He's a very interesting guy. He tends to I said it very nice way. He's a very high opinion of himself. Actually, he tends to write between humble brag and heroic about himself. But he had a really difficult job to do during the war, actually. But this is also it's only basically 2.5 to 3 months of a problem. So I think other things are going on. And then once the snow actually and the ice melts, things are fine, but it's a tough 3 months actually. And like I said, they were worried about food shortages in New England also. So I'm really interested to see like how the Pennsy literally digs away out of this problem actually. So.
And how did this experience, this virtual inability of the private railroad companies to handle this crisis, how did that contribute to the nationalization program?
I'm going to argue that's basically one of the main reasons it happened, actually. I mean, basically everything shuts down. And when people talk about this shutdown, they talk about, when you see some of the literature, they talk about the fact that all the freight cars are sort of trapped or on the East Coast. But I couldn't figure out, because I know a lot about rail, because I'm a rail fan, I know a lot about how railroad, I'm like, why are they all trapped? I mean, how could they be trapped? I mean, because basically the railroad yards on the East Coast are voluminous, but it turns out that they're trapped because they're mechanically frozen in place. And if there had been less, for other complex reasons we're getting into there, they weren't basically doing a lot of sending stuff back. They didn't want to send a lot of empty cars back. They're waiting for stuff to go back to Chicago, and so they're waiting basically to send stuff back. And this is like one-way traffic at this point. So this is stuff that's going to Europe, and nothing's being replaced in like on the East Coast to go back. So we're holding some of the rolling stock till they got loads in Chicago and basically like East Peoria or Denver or San Francisco. That's not happening. Everything's basically one-way traffic to basically the Western Front. If there had been like 100,000 less cars trapped in New York and New Jersey, this probably would not have happened. Or if it had happened, it would have been less of a problem. The biggest problem, this is something that McAdoo talks about directly in his memoirs, is basically talks about the coal shortage. The coal is coming out of West Virginia, Kentucky, because there's some coal in the Middle West at this point. Most stuff's coming out of the coal fields in Norfolk and Western, whatever. They literally can't unload this stuff. It's all sitting in New Jersey, and they can't. And the coal's actually freezing too. The coal's freezing inside the hopper cars. But the weirdest thing about New York Harbor was literally you have to break bulk when usually the things that we put on it, like all the traffic that goes to New York gets put on a barge. Actually, there's no other city like Antwerp. All of New York had basically the largest and in some ways the most antiquated port facilities on the planet Earth in 1914, which, like, if you look at what's going on in Europe, they're much more advanced. And also, like, they're building less cranes because they're actually starting to rebuild New York Harbor along the East River and along the Hudson, actually. So it's becoming a de-industrialized city in some ways, even as the Panama Canal opens. So there's a lot of things going on in New York from an infrastructure standpoint. They're at cross purposes, actually. So the war sort of throws everything at them that they can possibly deal with the canal being open, and the canal partially closes because of an earthquake, but then opens again, and then the war starts. And New York is just completely over capacity. New York Harbor is just over capacity. And then rail traffic is over capacity, and then the winter hits, and the entire thing just stops. Which I just found incredible. I never knew this before, because I grew up in like northern New Jersey. I grew up like going to look at this stuff by the Hudson River, and I never heard any of these stories. But the railroads know they're in a big fix. And also the other thing that happens is there's a movement to basically to extend nationalization into the 1920s. Actually, the USRA exists from 1970 to 1920. There's a lot of talk about nationalizing railroads for an additional 5 years, actually, which railroads do not want. I mean, Americans do not like the word socialism, actually, and now or basically in 1918, 1919. This is the beginning of the go-go 20s economy that's going to come in about another 2 years. So there's a lot of fear for the railroads. They need to basically demonstrate they can actually then meet all of the basically commercial transportation needs of the nation state, which they do. But it wouldn't have been a complete surprise had they nationalized railroads until like 1925. And I think there would have been congressional. I think that wouldn't have lasted that long. But they basically were given the ball and they dropped it, actually. And they were actually, I wouldn't say lucky, but they were able to like right the ship. But it was dicey there for a while, actually.
Were the railroaders really victims of their own success, having created a system too large and too vital to interests out of their control to actually be able to effectively manage at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I read something in economics. I'm reading a lot of economics now. A lot of economists write about it. I was surprised a lot of economists write about this, but it's before econometrics. You can actually read the articles having a PhD in like theoretical physics. You can follow what they're arguing. Um, and at one point, there's like, I mean, the amount of rail traffic at this point, the amount of railroad tracks in the United States is more than the rest of the world combined. It could go around the world like 5 or 6 times. Um, at this point, there's a lot of redundant trackage in the Middle West. Um, this is the peak of American railroading at this time. This is the absolute peak of number of locomotives, rolling stock, track, infrastructure. Everything's going to be things are going to get more efficient, but they're going to get smaller. So yes, when they go up to Congress in 1914, they're kind of saying we've kind of built a little bit too much and we don't have the money now to change things. And railroads, from a economic standpoint, give you a very small return, but you get the same return every year. You don't get a large. It's not like Silicon Valley. You get $1 billion here or there. The railroads give you like 2% every year. It's a constant 2%. But they had overbuilt at that point, and you're right. But a lot of things happened. No one foresaw the war happening, and certainly nobody foresaw this winter anomaly happening. And they're going to be getting smaller than for the rest of the 20th century. Actually, this is sort of their peak actually. And I think actually the railroads have never. And I've talked to some railroad people I meet sometimes at model railroad shows, and sometimes about working out. Even people that don't know much history know about the nationalization of the railroads and industry. If you talk to people at CSX or Norfolk, so they know about this, and they know it's something they don't ever want to happen again. So if nothing else, this entire period like etched itself into the minds of the prototype railroading community, and they basically know they can't drop the ball again. Actually, don't want to go up to Congress and have to be hat in hand and ask for something, or basically have to testify why they couldn't get their job done actually. And this is also, I should say, so this is also before there's no aircraft shipping at this point. There's no real trucking shipping at this point. The highway system is non-existent. There is they do actually nationalize riverine and barge traffic as part of this act too. Most people don't realize that gets nationalized also. This is not like Norway, everything moves by ship. This is basically you have stuff on the East Coast that moves by ship, some stuff in the Middle West near Chicago. But this is a railroad country at that point, actually. And I think that the reason if you look at old movies, and railroads are seen as the paradigm of basically progress and efficiency, they were, except during this one particular period when they overextended themselves, actually. And I think that they were surprised by their inability to meet their stated goals or their promises, actually. But and seriously, what I read this economist I was just reading the other day. In one of his chapters, he said it's not the railroad's fault or the weather's fault. And I'm kind of like, I'm going to put this quote in my chapter. I'm not sure. Well, then I'm not sure it has to be someone's fault, but someone has to be responsible. But he's not blaming the railroads or the weather. So I don't know who. I'm not sure whose fault it was then. Actually, the economist seems to be giving everyone an out, actually, which is very nice of him, I suppose. So
what else did you find in the Hagley archives to help you uncover this story?
I started looking at some of the DuPont stuff too. I did a lot of stuff on DuPont when I was in graduate school. Obviously DuPont, Hagley. I mean, those two things go together. If you don't know about that, you don't know anything about Hagley hand in glove. It was interesting how Hagley was dealing with the war because Hagley. I mean, I see how DuPont was. DuPont was a gunpowder manufacturer. I'm trying to see how they dealt with manufacturing. I didn't see as much in the Hagley collection about DuPont about what I was looking for. And I've actually done a pretty close study. UVA actually has a really good collection of chemical journals, which I think I'm the only person who's read any of them in the last 100 years. And I have an entire card of everything before 1925 in a little room that I use. And yeah, they talk about this, but not in a very clinical manner. They don't really talk about the chemists are not talking about environmental questions in a way that I find very useful, actually. It's not even a commodification question. You're just talking about how to make X, Y, and Z work. So I'm not really finding that with the DuPont papers out, but I hope to find some more stuff after I get through with this collections on the Pensi. I'm going to look at some other stuff when I have more time on some other collections. But it's interesting also. I mean, America at this point will become the preeminent world power at this point. But this is like their last step onto the world stage. And like I said, with recent events with respect to people's sudden interest in McKinley, America was an imperialist power from the 1890s forward. This idea of progressivism and imperialism together, I find a really interesting mix. And if you're asking technical questions through an environmental lens, you get to ask some really interesting historical questions, actually. So
No.
I have amazing respect for the Pennsylvania Railroad, what they were able to do. But I don't think anyone could have dealt with this problem successfully. They just didn't have I mean, we're used to dealing with storms. So that's what's interesting to me today. But basically, right now, like when it gets cold, Amtrak canceled a lot of stuff out of Chicago. I mean, the trains ran back then when they could, when it was cold and it was freezing and everything else. But they also had a lot more people that worked. I know years ago when the roof collapsed at the B&O Museum in Baltimore. Back in the old days, they used to hire people to sit on the roofs of roundhouses to just shovel off snow. I mean, that's how many
Mm.
workers they would have. I mean, it was a completely different work economy. Not a good work economy, mind you. But they overemployed local. They had so many employees they could actually keep them around to do extra duty. This scenario, this particular storm in 1718 just basically took a position they're already over capacity and the system just went completely dark actually.
Mm.
So it's I mean it's a one-off story, but it's a very interesting story, I think, actually. So
Well, Gerard, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's really been really fascinating.
thank you. It's always been fun. I look forward to always visiting Hagley. You guys do a great job up there. So
Oh, well, thank you so much.
I'll see you soon.
Great. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts or more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.